Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. This is Left Bank Books welcomes St. Louis native, CNN political commentator, New York Times best-selling author, and a former White House aide to President Bill Clinton, Keith Boykin, who will discuss his new book, Race Against Time, The Politics of a Darkening America. Tonight, Boykin will be in conversation with Webster University's Chief Diversity Officer, Vincent C. Fluellen, and a friend. Left Bank Books is St. Louis's oldest independent bookstore. We would like to thank all of our supporters, the supporters of Keith and Vincent, and everyone for their outpouring of love for our bookstore. We offer in-store shopping, curbside pickup, and delivery to anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world. We are happy to be able to bring our event series virtual. We believe that events are a way to expand your mind and bring in new thoughts to make the world a better place. We hope that you enjoyed this event, and we hope that you support Left Bank Books by purchasing a copy for you or for your friends at left-bank.com. I will put a direct link in the comments in just a moment. Purchasing a copy of the book from Left Bank Books allows us to keep our bookstore and staff operating, and it allows us to keep this event series going. So thank you so much for your support. I am Shane Mullen. I am the events coordinator for Left Bank Books. I help produce our hundreds of author events each year with a fantastic team here in St. Louis. We will be taking questions from you, the audience, towards the end of the hour, so you can type up your questions as a comment, and you can do that at any point in time throughout the event. And be sure to follow Left Bank Books on Facebook and YouTube to be notified about all of our fantastic virtual events. Now, about tonight's book, Race Against Time, The Politics of a Darkening America. A cold civil war has engulfed the nation. After a deadly pandemic, shocking incidents of police brutality, a racial justice crisis, and the fall of a dangerous demagogue, America remains more divided than at any time in decades. At the heart of this national crisis is the fear of a darkening America, a country in which there is no longer a predominant white majority. As the Republican Party has lost the popular vote in 7 of the last 8 presidential elections, its leaders have incited white Americans in a last-ditch race against time to stop the advance of a new multiracial emerging majority. Keith Boykin, longtime political commentator, has watched this white resentment consume the GOP over the course of a life in politics, activism, and journalism. He has also observed the divisions among Democrats as white progressives have postponed demands for full racial equity, while Black voters have often been too forgiving of party leaders who have failed to deliver. America can no longer avoid its long overdue reckoning with the past, Boykin argues. With the familiarity of personal experience and the acuity of historical insight, Boykin urges us to fight racism, sexism, xenophobia, and homophobia and save the Union, not just by making Black Lives Matter, but by making Black lives equal. Jericho Brown, author of The Tradition, says, Race Against Time is Keith Boykin's best book yet in a long list of books and anthologies that have helped define what cultural criticism is. This book is also an account of what it means to be overlooked in a capitalist landscape that denies the existence and contribution of Black queer citizens. What floors me is that Boykin's genius, from all the political and racial history from Reconstruction onward to his well-wrought recounting of the antics of U.S. presidents from Reagan to Trump, still allows him to remain a man of hope and a writer that affirms the spirit in essays that speak to us as a comforting brother would. Now, about tonight's speakers. Keith Boykin is a CNN political commentator, New York Times best-selling author, and a former White House aide to President Bill Clinton. Boykin teaches at the Institute for Research in African American Studies at Columbia University in New York, and previously taught at American University in Washington, D.C. He is a co-founder and first board president of the National Black Justice Coalition. He was a co-host of the BET Network's talk show My Two Cents, starred on the Showtime reality television series American Candidate, and was an associate producer of the film Dirty Laundry. And he has appeared on many other TV shows, including BET's Being Mary Jane. A graduate of Dartmouth College and Harvard Law School, Boykin is a Lambda Literary Award-winning author of 4 books, and he lives in New York City. Tonight, Keith will be in conversation with Vincent C. Fluellen. Vincent joined Webster University in October 2018. Reporting directly to the Chancellor, he provides key leadership for the university's core value of advancing diversity and inclusion as part of the educational mission through the university's network of domestic and international locations. With more than 20 years of experience weaving diversity, inclusion, and equity into the culture of education in the St. Louis area, Fluellen most recently served as Director of Equity and Inclusion at the College School in Webster Groves. Before taking his role at the college school, he taught in the Ladue School District and for Mary Institute and St. Louis the Mary Institute and St. Louis Country Day School. He also served as Center Director of the University City Children's Center. In response to the murder of George Floyd, Fluellen launched Webster Speaks, dialogues on race, equity, and inclusion. As host of the virtual series, he sits down with thought leaders and prominent Black voices and other people of color to discuss issues surrounding systemic racism. For his years of work promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion in education, Fluellen was named to the St. Louis Business Journal's 2020 Class of Diverse Business Leaders. Fluellen holds a Master of Social Work from the Board School of Social Work at Washington University in St. Louis, and his Bachelor of Arts in Education is from Maryville University. He is currently pursuing a Doctorate of Education through Webster University's School of Education. And now, without further ado, I'm so happy and proud to welcome our guests for the evening. We have Keith Boykin and Vincent C. Fluellen for Left Bank Books. If you could help me in giving them a giant round of applause.
Hey.
Hi.
Hey. Thanks, Shane.
Thank you.
Hey, Keith, welcome home.
Hey, Vincent. Glad to be here virtually. And thank you, Shane, for that introduction. I ran into Shane at a bar in New York City, I think about a month ago, and was surprised to see him. He told me that he was with Left Bank Books, and it was fun.
Nice connections there throughout St. Louis. Keith, your book, The Politics of a Darkening of America, Race Against Time, I found to be really fascinating, particularly as you start off, like so many of us, 2019, had we had the ability to look into the future, I don't know that we would all have been the way in which we spent those last days. You talk about your trip to Mexico. Talk a little bit more about what that was like for you on the eve of what became 2020.
Yeah, 2020 began for me, as I say in the very first page of the book, in a former women's prison in Mexico City. I was in Mexico for the New Year's Eve holiday, and went with my friends to this event, which was in a former women's prison. Walked through jail cells and cages, and it just felt kind of weird and eerie. But it was an ironic sort of twist or beginning for the year, because what it was actually telling me, even though I didn't think about it at the time, was that this could be an omen for what the year might provide to me. And 2020 ended up being an extraordinary, difficult, and unusual year for everybody. And for me, not just because it started in that location, but also because I ended up being arrested that year for the first time in my life and found myself in jail. So as I look back later, after I was in jail, it made me realize that sort of 2020, beginning in Mexico, and sort of started the wheels in progress and in motion to get me to the point where I ended up being arrested, covering a protest about George Floyd.
The juxtaposition and the irony of those two pieces, I do think is pretty profound. You talk about, and I'm gonna just quote you here, four cataclysmic crises were about to converge at once. First, we would be thrust into a deadly public health emergency, worse than any outbreak since the flu epidemic of 1918. At the same time, we would plunge into an economic crisis from more disruptive than any recession since the Great Depression began in 1929. Third, a racial justice movement would emerge larger than any since the protests after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 68. And finally, we would end the year in a crisis of democracy unlike anything seen in America since the disputed presidential election of 1876. This was not just a once-in-a-century confluence of events, it was a unique moment in our history. 4 gigantic tectonic plates would shift at the same time in America, putting into grave doubt the health of our people, the stability of our economy, the safety of our most vulnerable citizens, and the survival of our democracy. The result would shake the foundation of our nation. Keith, I'm curious to know what you have to say in terms of how all of those elements are connected to race in America.
Wow. Well, you kind of laid out what 2020 was all about. It was an unusual year, and that's what that paragraph that you just read describes. It was an unusual year, not just because of one thing or another, but because so many things happened at once. And I laid out 4 of those particular examples, and they all had to do with race. First was the public health crisis, obviously. The COVID pandemic that started in March of 2020, which became the worst pandemic in terms of deaths in recent American history, even overtaking the 1918 flu epidemic. But what we saw from the beginning is that it disproportionately impacted people of color, and particularly African Americans. In St. Louis, for example, in the early weeks in St. Louis, every single person who died of COVID was Black. Every single person who died of COVID in St. Louis at the beginning of the epidemic was Black. And so we knew from the beginning there was a racial disparity in who was being affected by this. And that also contributed to the response that people had. When people realized that it was disproportionately affecting Black people at the beginning, it created a sense of unwillingness from white people in particular to actually want to follow the public health guidelines, because it didn't seem like it was directly affecting them at first, they thought. So secondly, we get into this economic crisis because of the pandemic. And that economic crisis disproportionately impacted Black people as well. The Black unemployment rate skyrocketed, much more so even than the white unemployment rate. And this reflects this long-term disparity that in the entire history of the United States, as long as we've been keeping government data, the Black unemployment rate has never been as low as the white unemployment rate. The Black unemployment rate has almost always been nearly twice as high as the white unemployment rate. And that's a huge problem in our society that we've never been able to address and fix. Even as the Black unemployment rate has gone down certain times, it's still much higher than the white unemployment rate. And it was last year as well. Thirdly, we get to the question of the racial justice crisis. And this starts on Memorial Day, essentially. I mean, it had happened throughout the year with other incidents, but on Memorial Day, when George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis. And after that, protests erupted throughout the country. George Floyd, his death was a symbol, if you will, for the challenges that America is still facing in its unwillingness to deal with racism in our law enforcement and policing. But the irony about the George Floyd arrest and murder is that George Floyd had been a victim of all those crises. He had contracted COVID early on in the pandemic. He had lost his job because of the whole pandemic. And then thirdly, he was murdered by a Minneapolis police officer. So he was affected by the public health emergency, he was affected by the economic catastrophe, and he was affected by the racial justice crisis. Which leads us to the fourth issue, which is that his death, his murder, actually gave the impetus for the former president, Donald Trump, to initiate a new crisis, a crisis of democracy, the fourth crisis. And that he did because Black people and other people started taking to the streets in the largest mass demonstration in American history. And the Trump administration responded with the racist vitriol of the 1960s. When the looting starts, the shooting starts, Donald Trump tweeted, quoting directly from a racist police chief in Miami from the 1960s. It was this whole sort of fake law and order theme that led to the murder of 2 Black Lives Matter protesters in Kenosha. It led to, in St. Louis, the McCloskeys holding up their guns outside their home just because Black Lives Matter protesters were walking down the street. That was the crisis of democracy that ultimately led to the insurrection in January of 2021.
Wow, Keith. I think about the fact that under both our Republican and our Democratic presidents, Black Americans, we have seen no major structural changes since the 60s. And I'm wondering why it is that in the decades since the Civil Rights era, our stunning racial progress has yet to really eliminate these racial disparities.
Well, I think we've never tried to. I think you know these issues, Vincent. You study these issues. You work on these issues every day. We've never tried to eliminate these disparities. The traditional approach to racial discrimination in America, at least since we passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968, has been this. We will eliminate legal discrimination so that if you discriminated against somebody, it will no longer be allowed under the law. However, we won't do anything to make up for or compensate the hundreds and hundreds of years of racism and white supremacy and white privilege that have given white Americans a leg up over African Americans. So we've frozen in place those disparities. So if you have two people in different positions, one here, meaning white America, and one here, meaning Black America, and they've been basically coexisting with a system of racial segregation and slavery for hundreds of years, and then you say, okay, we're all equal now, but you haven't done anything to eliminate the disparity. We're all equal, but we continue with these same disparities. We have to change our mindset. It can't be enough just to say you can't discriminate against someone because of their race. We have to actually change so that the results have to equal equality. When people talk about equality, they tend to talk about it in terms of equal opportunities. I talk about it in terms of equal outcomes, which most people think of in terms of equity. I talk about it in terms of equal outcomes. It's not enough that we just allow everybody to walk into a restaurant or buy a home equally, quote unquote, right, if we don't eliminate those disparities that persisted from the beginning that enabled the racial discrimination to continue.
It's so interesting. We talk about so often the playing field is equal, right, and even, and that we are all starting at the same place, right? And we know that to not be true. And in our system, our government was set up in many ways to continue to perpetuate that. I think often about, the whole fact of, men at that time, men who served in the military, returning home and being able to, particularly white men, being able to access a form of support from the government, right? We might actually call that welfare, that allowed for them to buy a home, right? Allow for them to go to college and begin this American dream, while their Black colleagues and counterparts were not given those same opportunities.
I think you're exactly right, Vincent. That's one of the two prime examples I always talk about when I discuss welfare. The first being the Homestead Act, which passed in the 1860s, which gave away millions and millions of acres of land in the western part of the United States, so that it could be developed primarily by white people. Mm-hmm. Just gave it away, essentially. And then you move to the post-war era after World War II that you're discussing, and the Congress passes the GI Bill, which essentially gives primarily white people access to housing so they can have a loan and get a mortgage to buy a home in the suburbs and get away from Black people in the cities. And secondly, it gives them an opportunity to go to college after they've come back from war. Meanwhile, Black people were still being discriminated against. Brown versus Board of Education happened on May 17th, 1954. The World War II ended in 1945. So we have a whole 9-year period after the war ends before we even make an attempt to address racial discrimination only in public schools. And then we have another 10 years until 1964 before we actually legally outlaw discrimination in other places, in public accommodations and employment and so forth. So the whole myth that we were fighting for freedom in World War II doesn't make sense to Black people when we weren't getting the freedom that white people were coming home to. And the other tragedy about this, and I'm glad you mentioned about white men, because white men are 29% of the population in our country. And in spite of that, they're 98% of our presidents of the United States. They're virtually 90% or more of our Fortune 500 CEOs. They're more than 90% of the leaders of our government institutions throughout our history. White men are a minority of our country, and yet they continue to dominate in every single sector. It's not because they're more superior in intellect or knowledge. It's because our society was set up to enable white male patriarchy. At the very beginning, women couldn't participate in the democracy. African-American people couldn't participate in democracy. If you were a white male property owner, this country was for you. If you weren't, you were screwed. You couldn't even if you were a white man, if you were poor, you still couldn't vote in a way that allowed you to change the outcome of who your U.S. senator was. We couldn't even vote directly for our U.S. senators in this country until the 20th century. So the idea that when people go back and they say, "Oh, America is the Constitution, the Declaration were perfect. It's all part of American exceptionalism," we have to really think about the truth of what our country is about and has always been about, and that's why people are afraid of talking about critical race theory, which has absolutely nothing to do with that. That's why they're afraid of talking about history. That's why the Trump administration signed a rule to prevent discussion even about diversity in public institutions. So there's an active effort to make us not know that history so that we don't hold the institutions accountable that have unfortunately targeted us.
You know, I think about the time in which I was in school, grade school, and in our history books, there would be blue boxes. You know, you might be talking about the war, and then there'd be a blue box that might talk about the role of women. It was a small little, you know, off to the side piece. They maybe even would do that for Blacks as well. And I think it's so interesting how Blacks and other marginalized communities have just been a part of like the side of America, but yet have played such a major role in the functioning of America. I think about, you know, back during the COVID pandemic and the fact that, you know, I had the luxury of being able to work from home, right? And being able to go to the grocery store if needed, or to have it delivered to my home. But one thing that was for sure is that most of the people working in the grocery stores were people of color, and they had no choice but to go to work. And I'm just amazed by the fact that we have such a hard time still understanding that the disparities do exist and still exist and are real.
Yeah, I think you're right. I don't even know that it's true that we have a hard time understanding it. I think that people are invested in not understanding those things.
Talk a little bit more about that.
Well, you know, I talk about a little bit about this even in introduction to the book, where I talk about sort of the idea of this racial bribe that goes back to the 1600s, when white, poor, working class, indentured servants teamed up with poor Black people and poor Native people and came together to fight against the wealthy white planter class. The most obvious example of this I talk about is Bacon's Rebellion in 1675. And as a result of this kind of rebellion, when you have this multiracial coalition of poor people coming together against the white racial elite, the white racial elite, the planter class, decides to construct this whole notion of race, of racial privilege, and allows poor white people to buy into that in order to co-opt them. So even though they don't have any sort of economic benefit because they're still poor, they get this privilege of whiteness. one of my former law professors, Derek Bell, has referred to what he called the property right in whiteness. This idea that whiteness becomes some sort of an asset. It becomes an economic benefit for people. And you get that property right regardless of your actual economic status. But because you're white, you still get to be treated in a way that even wealthier Black people in some instances don't get. Now, certainly wealthy Black people, wealthy people of all races can buy their way out of certain circumstances. But if I go out into a street in New York City and raise my hand to get a taxi, the taxi driver doesn't know how much money I have. The taxi driver only knows that I'm Black. Right. And I'm still more likely to be discriminated against, less likely to get the taxi cab than a poor white person.
Your book, it spans a lot here, and I'm trying to pick parts of it to have us discuss here. And one of the things I'm interested in is the fact that we talk about how social media has been a platform, obviously, that has in many ways been helpful, but it also in so many ways has misinformed us. It's been it's a great base and platform for reporting in the mainstream media. And how has the vehicle of social media been used to produce national pressure campaigns?
Well, I think social media can be a valuable tool. And it was a very helpful organizing tool last year in terms of getting people out to protest about George Floyd, about Breonna Taylor, about Rayshard Brooks, to raise awareness about their deaths and the circumstances of their deaths in a way that would have been more difficult in the past, particularly because the gatekeepers in the mainstream media weren't particularly interested in covering a lot of these stories. I mean, we see this even right now with the mainstream media's obsession with the story of one white woman who disappeared. And understandably, people are concerned about what happened and the person who may have had a role in killing her. But on the other hand, as African Americans, as people of color, as indigenous people, as Latinos and Latinas, we know from our lived experiences that when one of us disappears, we don't get that kind of media attention. We don't see the breathless coverage on the nightly news or in the cable networks about what happened to our loved ones when they aren't around. And so the social media can be a driving force, either A, in correcting the misinformation or the lack of information in the mainstream media, or B, just encouraging the mainstream media to actually pay attention to something they weren't previously noticing. One of the examples I talk about in the book is the Trayvon Martin incident, where after Trayvon Martin was murdered by George Zimmerman, the mainstream media didn't really cover it for a while. And it took a social media campaign for days before the mainstream media paid attention. And so I think it was something like 49 days after George Zimmerman killed Trayvon Martin that he was finally arrested. And that is largely attributable to the work of the people on their computers in the streets, but who generated this social media and live campaign to get justice for Trayvon Martin.
And in that, so often they say the Black folks are just so angry, right? And they then, that outrage is actually more so treated as a criminal justice issue rather than a social justice concern. Why do you think that is as well?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of ways to look at this. One, why wouldn't we be angry?
Right.
I mean, if you lived in a society where you were constantly being discriminated against and treated differently, wouldn't you be upset about that? There's no reason for us not to be angry. And there's an old saying that white America should be grateful that Black Americans only want justice and equality and not revenge. Because if we wanted revenge, then white America would be even more concerned about what's going on. We just want their basic right to be treated equally, to be treated like human beings, to be treated as citizens of this country. But secondly, if you look at the way that a lot of white Americans have reacted to the mask mandates and the vaccine mandates, or just even the idea of following public health guidelines in the middle of a pandemic. White Americans are mad too, and they're mad about things that have nothing to do with us directly, but indirectly we're still impacted by that. And they're mad about the idea that their leader, their dear leader, Donald Trump, lost the election. So mad that they actually staged an insurrection and tried to take over the United States government, take over the Capitol to stop the counting of ballots in an election, something we've never seen in this country before. So it always baffles me when people talk about black people being mad without understanding the whole history of white people being mad in this country. I mean, wasn't even the first insurrection we had in this country. We had a civil war that cost 600,000 American lives because white people didn't like the idea, particularly in the South, of giving up slavery. We had to go through periods after that where white people were so resistant in state after state, particularly in the South, that they actually lynched black people over and over and staged mobs and massacres to kill black people. We had another insurrection in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, where after a hybrid multiracial government was elected, the white people were so upset that they burned down the town and drove out the government from power. That's how upset they were. Then we get into the 1900s and we have all these incidents, some of which I talk about in the book. 1917, the East St. Louis race massacre. 1919, the Red Summer, where black people were killed in cities all across the country. 1921, the Tulsa massacre, which we are commemorating the 100th anniversary of right now. Rosewood, and so many other incidents that took place over the course of our history that we don't talk about. So I just turn that question around when people talk about black people being mad. White people have been the ones who have been mad historically and directed that madness, their anger, toward us. Carol Anderson writes about this in her book, White Rage, which I also recommend. But we really need to sort of rethink the way we talk about who's mad and why they're mad. Because from my point of view, African Americans have a lot of reason to be mad, especially since our country still seems unwilling to deal with some of these fundamental issues.
And all we are really doing is asking for some dignity, right? And just the ability to just simply exist. But instead, I think so often it's the flip, right? And it's the policing and the criminalization of black folks taking place more and more versus just recognizing the fact that this is our call for our rights.
Well, you see that even with the treatment of the Haitian immigrants, with the border police officers on horseback with whips, threatening the Haitian migrants who are simply seeking asylum in this country, just like other people from different countries have sought as well. But I've never seen images like that before, not in my lifetime, of white men on horses attacking black people just because they were exercising the right to ask for asylum to live in this country, which is a legal thing to do, especially considering everything that Haiti's been through with earthquakes and assassinations and crises. And it's unfathomable that we call ourselves the shining city on the hill, and we speak about American exceptionalism, and we have these words inscribed on the base of the Statue of Liberty, but we don't always practice what we preach about being a welcoming nation.
Those images that I saw this morning of that with that whip against that Haitian's body was it was traumatic. It really was traumatic in that it just reminded me of the overseer and the slavery and those days there. That was hard. I think also, Keith, I'd like to talk with you some about your hometown here. St. Louis, and how race has also played a major part here in St. Louis. About 5 years ago or so, the Missouri History Museum had a special exhibit called Civil Rights #1 in Civil Rights, and it talked about how in St. Louis, so many Supreme Court cases. So many civil rights issues were out of St. Louis that really helped to transform St. Louis, or the nation for that matter. I think about some of those great classic spaces and places here in town, and just wonder if you can maybe talk some about race here in St. Louis.
Yeah, I mean, the most famous case everyone knows, the Dred Scott v. Sanford case, which was a case that was decided in Missouri, in St. Louis, at the old courthouse. And you know, the legal history of St. Louis is fascinating, but there's also a racial history in St. Louis that is not necessarily directly related to the law. And I talk about that in the book, just how the institutions that are so central to my identity as a native St. Louisan were institutions that were shaped by race and Reconstruction. I talk about three institutions in particular in the book. One is the Homer G. Phillips Hospital, which no longer exists, but that's the hospital where I was born. Two, you too, exactly, right. Two of us from Homer G. Two, Sumner High School, which is where my mom went to high school. And three, I talk about the Annie Malone May Day Parade. And with Homer G. Phillips Hospital, I never knew the entire time, for most of my life, actually, I never knew that Homer G. Phillips was a black lawyer who actually fought to defend some of the black people who were accused of participating in defending themselves in the 1917 East St. Louis race massacre. And Homer G. Phillips used his platform to try to help build a hospital for African Americans in the Ville area. But he died before he was able to see the hospital completed. And a few decades after he died, I was born in that hospital. The Sumner High School was one that I had never really known the history about. My mom had told me before about all these different people who had graduated from Sumner High School. And I knew about Chuck Berry, and I knew about Julius Hunter, and I knew about Tina Turner and Arthur Ashe. But I didn't know who Sumner was. Who was this guy, Charles Sumner? And I discovered in research years later that Charles Sumner was actually a white Massachusetts senator who was one of the abolitionists who wanted to sort of end slavery. But he also had sort of a complex story as well, which, you know, it shows once again that even white people who have been sympathetic to our cause can't always be reliable to defend that cause for a long-term basis. And third is Annie Malone. And Annie Malone, of course, was not only known for the parade, but the children's home, Annie Malone Children's Home, which she created. She donated a building to the children's home, the orphanage, and they named it after her. But she was a black businesswoman, a very successful, wealthy black businesswoman who sold hair care products. One of her proteges, her students, was Sarah Breedlove, who people know as Madam C.J. Walker. And so there's this whole rich history in St. Louis about African Americans that's directly related to race. And I have some personal stories I never even shared in the book, but I remember like even the Veiled Prophet Fair. I know that was a big controversy recently in the news, but I remember when I was a child, my aunt telling me about the VP Fair, because I remember they used to have something by the riverfront, by the arch.
That's right.
And I said to my aunt that I wanted to go, and my aunt told me they ain't gonna let black folks down there. And I was thinking, what do you mean they ain't gonna let black folks? How can they not let me there? It didn't register to me as a concept that I could not go someplace that I wanted to go in my lifetime. But my aunt had lived through segregation in America, and from her point of view, that was not someplace where I'd be welcome. She wasn't saying that there was a law to stop me from going there, but I would not be welcome there. And there were still communities in St. Louis when I lived there, and I imagine it may still be the case now, where black people could not go. I mean, you could go there, but it was clearly an unwelcome place for you to be.
Yeah, that's that history of that Veiled Prophet Parade, and you're talking about Fair St. Louis, or what was called the VP Fair at one point. They tried to rebrand it, right?
Oh, okay. I didn't know that.
Same, Bud Light, still the same, right?
Right.
So you have served in the Clinton White House, and I'm curious to know how you felt during Barack Obama's campaign and his presidency. Often I think that there was a lot of pressure from Black folks placed upon him in terms of expectations. And I think in many ways, white folks did not expect much of him. And we certainly know how Trump treated him throughout that time. Just kind of, if you can kind of talk a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked, because the book actually goes into several of the past presidents. I start with the first George Bush in 1989 and 1993. Then I talk about Bill Clinton, who was president from 1993 to 2001, and my service in his administration. And I talk about George W. Bush, who was president from 2001 to 2009, and what happened during his administration dealt with race. And then we get to the Obama administration. I went to law school with Barack Obama, so I've known him for decades. And I found that Barack Obama was essentially the same person as president that he was when he was a law student, in the sense that he's always been sort of a cautious, incremental type. Maybe his mindset politically might be more progressive, but in terms of his mentality, his approach, he's always struck me as being sort of cautious and incrementalist. Now that's important because white Republicans and conservatives feared that Obama was going to unleash some sort of anti-white racial revenge upon them. And I think that was a big source of concern for a lot of people. The idea that if you have a Black president, even one who, by the way, had a white mother, so I mean, what really did you really think he was going to do? That he was somehow going to come in and turn the tables on them and do to them what they had been doing to us. Yeah. Never a possibility. That was never even in the realm of possibilities with Barack Obama. And Black progressives, I think a lot of Black progressives felt that Obama could have or should have both done more to facilitate the cause of African Americans, the things that were important to us. And there's a section in the book where I talk about Obama's speech to Morehouse College graduates. And he goes down to Morehouse and he gives his speech and he tells the graduates essentially that you can't blame racism for your problems. And you have a responsibility to sort of to let that go and do what you want and try to overcome anyway. Now, this is interesting because I've said to people before that this is not any different from the language I've heard from Black people, Black church leaders, Black leaders of other types from the beginning of time. That Black people have to be twice as good. You know, we know that whole line already. But what was different in this case is that this was the president of the United States speaking. And that's an important, significant difference, because when other people were saying that, if your preacher was saying that, or if your teacher was saying that, or if your uncle or aunt or your parents were saying that, they were saying that because they knew that not only was the country racist, but they had no control over it.
Right.
What was different is that here was somebody who actually had control over the government, who had the ability to do something about it. So it seemed odd to hear him say to this group of Black college students that they shouldn't blame racism for their problems. And so that's what a sort of approach is philosophically that Obama, I think, disappointed Black progressives. Now, having said that, for the mainstream of Black America, I think I can't think of anything Obama could have done that would have made him unpopular among the majority of African Americans. And partly, I think a lot of Black people felt, which was that we've had so many bad white presidents. Even if Obama was a horrible president, he couldn't be any worse than all the bad white presidents before him. So, you know, we're just happy to have a Black president.
Very much so. I'd like to remind the audience to type in your questions into the Q&A. We're going to shortly switch to Q&A from the audience.
This is an incredible conversation, and I have a bunch of questions that I would like to ask, but I'm certain that the audience watching would love to ask questions as well. So, yeah, if you are watching, which I know you are, type up questions. I have an immediate question on what you just talked about, and I'm wondering if, as a political commentator, you have any opinions on states that have been democratically run for many years. You mentioned like unleashing this like movement and how that was a big fear of Republicans. And I'm curious if it has ever been run as an example of states that have been democratically run for so many years and haven't done any of this unleashing. And if they...
Let me ask, Shane, can I interrupt you? Because I want to ask, when you say Democrat, are you using little d Democratic or capital D, the Democratic Party? I'm not sure I understand.
Democratic Party, yeah.
Oh, Democratic Party, okay.
Yeah. So like states like New York and California that have been blue for many years.
Okay. So the question is, of those states, what's the issue then about them?
Well, you talked about how Republicans feared
Oh.
Obama unleashing this progressive agenda,
Yeah.
and it has not really been ever done before by a president.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, I mean, this is a question about the timidity of the Democratic Party, really. And this is a concern I've had about the party, and I've been a lifelong Democrat as well, which is that the African Americans have been the most loyal constituency of the Democratic Party, historically speaking, and remain so today. There's no way Joe Biden would be president or Barack Obama would be president without Black people. In fact, if you look at all of our elections since the Civil Rights Act in 1964, no Democratic candidate for president has won the white vote since 1964. Not one. Not Jimmy Carter, not Bill Clinton, definitely not Barack Obama. Not one has won the white vote. And so the Republican Party has sort of become the white party in America. The only group of people demographically, racial or ethnic group, that votes for Republicans these days are white people. Black people, Latinos, Asian Americans, Native Americans do not vote for the Republican Party. It's just this group of white people. And so when we have the Census Bureau saying that the white population is dwindling, becoming smaller, it creates a sense of fear for white Americans who are of a conservative ilk that somehow their days are numbered. This is the fear of a darkening America. So that's why they've created these hundreds of different bills that they've introduced in state legislatures like Missouri to try to make it harder for people to vote. Voter restriction laws in Georgia, because they lost the state of Georgia, which they hadn't lost in decades, to a Democrat. They actually passed a law even making it illegal to hand out water to people who are waiting in long lines to vote. That's how desperate they are, because they've constructed the system so that they know that the Black people who live in places like Atlanta have to go and vote places where they don't have enough poll workers, they don't have enough machines, so they know they're going to be long lines. They hope those long lines will discourage them. So if somebody from a church tries to bring a bottle of water to you while you're waiting in line, that's now against the law in the state of Georgia. This is how desperate they are to cling to power. So I don't see any evidence that any of these states that are democratically run are doing anything to sort of take away the power of white people. What Democrats have been talking about historically is about helping all people who happen to be in need. The problem, though, Shane, is that I think the Democrats haven't always delivered for Black people in particular, and for people of color in general. And I can think of 3 examples currently that need to be addressed. One, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. We're more than a year after George Floyd was killed, and after all the racial crises and the so-called reckoning that took place last year, and Congress still hasn't passed the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. 2, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. You know, John Lewis passed away last year. He was a champion of voting rights who was beaten bloody at the Bloody Sunday March at the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. And yet we still don't have a Voting Rights Act reauthorization after the Republican-dominated Supreme Court destroyed the Voting Rights Act and gutted it in the Shelby County v. Holder decision. And third, even today, we still don't have passage of an anti-lynching act. So the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act has been introduced repeatedly in Congress after Congress, and we still can't get Congress to pass an anti-lynching act. So we now have a Democratic president, a Democratic House, and a Democratic Senate, and they can't pass these three important pieces of legislation, or just basic pieces of legislation that might benefit African Americans. So, this should cause some concern for African Americans. How do we make sure the party is held accountable and does what we ask it to do? But B, this should actually relieve the concerns of the conservatives who think that the Democratic Party is going to take away their rights. The Democratic Party hasn't been, at least since the 60s, very effective in terms of pushing on some of these racial issues. They've been pushing on other issues and basically just holding the line on the racial issues as much as they can.
I knew that our audience would have no idea where to go. Interesting. Let me see if I can fix that really quick.
You okay?
I'm getting an.
Oh, I heard the echo too at the end, but yeah.
Okay. Our audience has some really fantastic questions, so let's get to some of those. Adam says, "Hey, Keith and Vincent, as one who has deep experience in the American political sphere, what are your thoughts about radical Black liberation and its place in the American political imagination?"
I think it's important. Radical Black liberation is an element of the Black experience. I've often said that Black people are complicated. And I talk about this in the book as well. I like to say that Black people are politically progressive but socially conservative. But in the context of political liberation, of Black political liberation, I'd have to say every aunt and uncle and cousin and relative I know in St. Louis, going back to the time when I was a child, they've always been radical in terms of their perception of the world. Always supported radical approaches to the liberation of Black people and what the government should do in response to that. Now, that doesn't mean they vote that way, because there aren't those kind of opportunities for people. So this is kind of the disconnect. On the one hand, we support that, but also we've been realist. And so Black people have historically voted Democratic, at least in the past half century or so, because those were the only options that were available to us. There weren't a lot of Black radical liberation opportunities for us to sort of pursue in terms of electoral progress. But I think it's an important part of our history. It's an important part of our tradition. It's an important part of what we need. And part of the reason why I feel that is because we need agitators. We need people to fight for things that the mainstream people won't fight for. A lot of people get upset when I say this. It's like, oh, you're gonna scare off people and they won't vote and the Democrats won't get elected. Enough of that. It's time to have some sort of sophisticated approach to this. We needed Malcolm just as much as we needed Martin. Yeah. They both relied on each other. As long as Malcolm was there out in the streets fighting and saying by any means necessary, it made it easier for Martin to go and meet with Lyndon Johnson and say, if you don't give me this, I can't control what the people out there are going to do. We need that. We need we don't need an either or strategy. We need an everything and strategy. And the strategy that includes all of those different ideas, not just one or the other.
Deb is asking, what do you think of the recent rally for the people arrested for the January 6th riot being compared to the, I think there might be a word missing there. But what if Black people would have held this type of rally for BLM rioters in quotation marks?
Well, I mean.
Right.
Do we even have to answer? I mean, we all know the answer to that question. These what if questions are so fascinating to me because we keep saying these. As Black people, we keep saying these over and over again. What if Barack Obama had done the stuff that Donald Trump did? Imagine how people would respond to that. What if Black people actually tried to take over the United States Capitol in an armed insurrection? Imagine how the country would respond to that. We know the answers to these things. There's no secret about this. America is a hypocritical, racist country. It always has been. And every Black person with any common sense knows that. And the fact that we have to continue to point out these examples is a reflection, I think, of just this whole notion that Toni Morrison talks about when she discusses racism. She says the very purpose of racism is diversion. It's to divert your attention. It's to, if you say that Obama is being discriminated against, and they ask you 1,000 questions to prove it, and you have to go prove that Obama is being discriminated against. If you say that the waitress treated you badly because of your race, they ask you 1,000 questions. You have to prove that the waitress treated you badly because of your race. If you say that you can't get a taxi when you walk out in the street in New York, Keith, you have to show me some scientific study to prove this. This is all a diversion. It's all designed to keep us focused on proving and explaining to white America instead of arguing our case for ourselves. The case is obvious, and anybody who doesn't want to believe it is only not believing it because they choose not to, not because the evidence isn't there. Just open your eyes, wake up, read a book, read this book, and find out what's really going on.
Sandra asked a question, but then you answered it. So asking a follow-up question. The 3 legislative initiatives on the table that need to be passed and signed into law, that's the topic. If those 3 pieces of legislation were made law, what is next? What can we do to prevent? Well,
yeah, and that's a great question, because those 3 are just the floor. They're not the ceiling. But if we have to be able to get to the floor before we can actually get to the ceiling. I want to talk about reparations for a second, because it's not necessary. To me, I don't think reparations is the be-all and the end-all. I think it's important, but it's not the end. It's a step in the progress. The end, to me, is equality of outcomes. And reparations may or may not get us there. And I think if we focus too much on the specific tactic, then we miss the point of what the goal should be. The goal has to be that we eliminate these racial disparities in America. Now, having said that, reparations is such a hard thing for America to talk about. It's hard. I mean, we had Larry Elder in California talking about the idea that white people were the ones who were entitled to reparations for having their property taken away from them because the slaves were freed. And so when we talk about reparations, a lot of white people start getting very sensitive, because they start thinking, well, then I'm going to have to be accountable. Somebody's going to take something from me. And, it's this whole zero-sum game mentality that if Black people or Latinos or Asian Americans or Native Americans, whatever group gains, somehow that means I'm going to lose. So the best example I can think of for people who believe in these causes, this also goes back to the Black liberation question. The best example I can think of for people who believe in these causes is something that comes from the LGBTQ movement, which goes back to the issue of marriage. I remember back in the late 1990s, early 2000s, when not everybody, but the majority of the American people were opposed to marriage equality for LGBTQ people. And everybody in the community of leaders, most of the Democrats were afraid to go there too. And so they created this position called civil unions as sort of their default question. So we're not going to be able to get you marriage. That's too much, but we'll let you have civil unions. So that way we can feel like we're doing something. But I remember having this discussion with someone named Evan Wilson, who was the head of a group called Freedom to Marry back in the 1990s. And his philosophy was, if you shoot for the moon, even if you don't make it, at least you'll be in the stars. And so that was the reason why they moved for marriage equality, because by setting the goalposts so high, they made everyone who didn't agree with that, who wanted to sound like they were reasonable, at least have to come to the point where they agreed to civil unions. They weren't even talking about civil unions before. And I think African Americans should be similarly bold in asking for what we want. If you start negotiating against yourself from the beginning, you're never going to be able to accomplish your goals. You have to ask for everything you want and then something. And then the conversation starts to move up. Instead of having the conversation down here, we're having a conversation up here. So at least you're in the ballpark of what you want to talk about. So I think that it's important to have those discussions, as difficult as they may be, to push for not just reparations, but for true, full equality for African Americans.
All right. Lane is asking a question from Facebook. Thanks for this important this will be our last question.
Okay.
Thanks for this important conversation. Mr. Boykin, my husband is a huge fan. He's a city council member in Minneapolis. Minneapolis is a complete Dem slate.
What's his name? I wonder. I don't know him personally, maybe, but I probably know who it is. But anyway, go ahead.
Does not say.
I remember there were several African American LGBTQ city council members elected a few years ago. I met one of them, Andrea Jenkins, but I haven't met the others. But anyway, go ahead.
Philippe Cunningham.
Philippe Cunningham, yeah, I follow him on Twitter. Yeah.
So saying Minneapolis is a complete Dem slate. A huge conversation we are having right now is centered around feeling safe versus actually being safe. Gang and community violence is up across the country for the compounded issues you've discussed, combined with conscientious challenges of legitimacy of the cops. Throwing more police at the issue doesn't work, yet so many of my husband's constituents want more cops. What's your take on feeling safe versus being safe and leaning into the devil we know?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. That could be a whole discussion right there. This has taken me a long time to get to this point, but I feel like policing cannot be reformed. I think that the whole problem with policing is, first of all, is rooted in racism. The whole history of the slave patrols to the present. But secondly, the culture of policing is so toxic today that it is so focused on law enforcement and not on public safety. And so I wrote something about this earlier today. I posted on Twitter that from the very beginning, from the slave patrols to the present, to the DEA, to the Border Patrol agents, to the local law enforcement officers, policing in America has primarily focused on protecting white people by controlling black and brown people. That doesn't help black and brown people. And this is all rooted in this fear that white people have about black people. And they've had it ever since the beginning when they started bringing black people in from Africa. They had it during the 19th century when the rebellions were taking place with Nat Turner and Gabriel Prosser and others. And they still have it today. A lot of people have this fear about black people, and that's the reason why they still want the police force to be there to control black people and brown people so we don't get out of control. But I think that there's a fundamental problem in that. We don't do enough about public safety. And I can't think of anybody who would rather have a police officer arrive after the fact and arrest somebody or go look for somebody who's murdered someone in your family, as opposed to preventing the crime from happening in the first place. And we know how to prevent crime. We know what causes crime. We just don't do anything about it. So instead of saying, well, why is there so much crime in this community? We should be asking, why are there no jobs in this community for people of color and for African Americans in particular? Instead of saying, why is there so much crime? Why don't we have adequate health care coverage for people in this community? Instead of saying, why is there so much crime? We should be saying, why are the schools not up to snuff in this community? Instead of saying, why is there so much crime? We should be saying, why is there no affordable housing? Why is there no clean drinking water? Why is there no safe environments? If you create the conditions where people can live comfortably, we know that crime drops. But we don't make those investments. In fact, we've made a conscious effort to stop making those investments. Going back to the Reagan administration, we started cutting the top tax rate from 70%, which it was in the Nixon administration, to 28%. The top marginal tax rate was cut more than half to 28% in the Reagan administration. And so all that money that's taken out of the federal government that we no longer have to spend is money that was going to help people who were living in cities and help people who needed housing and help people who wanted to go to good schools. And suddenly people complain, well, why is it that there's so many problems in urban communities? It's because we defunded those communities and we started redirecting those resources to the suburbs. So suddenly we're building bridges and roads and highways that go to the suburbs. We're even destroying black communities so we can build highways to the suburbs. my family, I have family that was buried in one of the cemeteries over there by the airport. They dug up the whole cemetery so they could build a highway, Interstate 70. There's a whole history of this in our country that we have to re-examine. So the answer is not more police officers. The answer, and we even have this in New York City with our current Black Democratic nominee for mayor, who is talking about more police officers, which is a sad state of affairs. The answer is not more police officers. The answer is more services, more jobs, more healthcare, more education, better schools, more affordable housing, cleaner environment for people who are in underserved communities. That's the way to deal with crime, not by making it a law enforcement issue, but by making a public safety issue. And we know that public safety is increased when people live in comfortable communities where their needs are being met.
I'm really glad that we took the time to get that answer for that question. I want to remind the audience watching to take this call to action, read this book. I hope that you enjoyed this event and got as much out of this event as I did. Left Bank Books has this book available for sale right now. You can find it on our front table. You can buy it online, have it shipped anywhere in the country. Buy a copy for your friend, buy a copy for yourself. And yes.
Can I say something? I love Left Bank Books. Every time I write a book, I always go there and do a book signing. And I wish I could be there in person right now. But at least I'm here. And if you buy the book, if you want to get in contact with me, you can reach me on Twitter or Instagram at Keith Boykin, and I can send you a book plate so you can have a signed book. I'm not sure if I'll be in St. Louis soon, but if I am, of course, I'll sign the books there. But I really want you to support the bookstore, support independent bookstores, support Left Bank Books, because they've been so helpful to me over the course of the years, and other authors I know as well. So buy the book, buy at Left Bank Books. There's a button I think you can click to do it.
There's a link in the comments.
There's a link in the comments you can do you can hit to buy the book, and it really makes a difference if you buy it sooner instead of later. Not just for the bookstore, but for me as the author. The first week or two is really what's most important. Just like a movie, when a movie comes out, the first week or two is what really dictates whether the book is considered successful. So if you can, I would really appreciate your support. So thank you very much.
And Vincent, thank you as well for this incredible interview that you did. I'm big fan of yours, good friend, and I can't wait to see both of you again.
Can I say one more thing too about Vincent? I have to thank you, Vincent, for stepping at the last minute because I don't know, you probably couldn't tell from the discussion, but Vincent, literally, I spoke to him yesterday, I think it was yesterday, and he agreed to do this at the very last minute, to do this interview, do this discussion, conversation. And I've known Vincent for years and years. So I really appreciate you, Vincent. You're a dear friend and a real trooper to come in and do this at the last minute.
My pleasure. Thank you, Keith, for reaching out. Kevin.
Hi.
Thanks for giving me the opportunity.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Kane.
Have a great rest of your evening. And to the audience watching, thank you so much.